future participants. As I was saying, my name is Robert Forloni, and I am the Program Officer for Partnerships at Regional for Maryland Humanities. And one of the programs I oversee are the Regional Humanities Network. So this workshop is the first in a series of what we hope will be more common workshops and capacity building pieces as we move forward going into the future. The Regional Humanities Networks is a program that was set up by Maryland Humanities in the past to help take the resources and the different things that we have at Maryland Humanities throughout the state, specifically focusing in regional and rural communities as part of that process, but getting a sense of how we can supply and really offer support to people throughout the state itself. Going forward, we're making some revisions and changes on what the Regional Humanities Networks did in the past. We would typically meet either virtually or in person once or twice a year and convene conversations and listen to people about what their interests were, how we could support them. But there's been a shift in this respect with regards to providing technical assistance and capacity support. So as part of this process moving forward, we're hoping to offer workshops, public sessions, discussion series, providing resources online with regards to our website, a number of different resources to try to really impact the community in a much more direct way. If there are specific topics you have of interest, if you have individuals who are interested in the Regional Humanities Network, please let them contact me. So in addition to technical assistance, we're also expanding who's part of our community. We know there's a large number of organizations and institutions which are undertaking important work within their communities, but might not self-identify as humanity organizations as such. So while we've worked with museums, libraries, historic houses, schools in the past, we're also looking for service organizations that are undertaking this work. So if you know of any of these individuals or groups that are undertaking this work, please let them get in contact with me, and I would greatly appreciate it. Our first workshop is today going to be focusing on basically language access. And the idea behind this is making sure that we can incorporate and include some voices and communities who we haven't typically reached out to in the past. So as part of this process, we're inviting Dr. Laura Gonzales with us to have a conversation, and she's going to be sharing some of the work that she's done with a variety of different multilingual communities in Florida as some case studies. I'm going to formally introduce her. Dr. Laura Gonzales has 15 years of experience working with multilingual communities to design tools, technologies, and programs that are accessible across languages. She's an award-winning researcher who has published 4 books and more than 20 articles on the importance of language access, community engagement, and technology design. Her latest monograph, Designing Multilingual Experiences and Technical Communication, won the 2023 Conference on Community Writing Outstanding Book Award and the 2024 Research Impact Award from the Conference on College Composition and Communication. I do want to say that we'll be monitoring the chat, so feel free if you have any questions to post it in the chat, and Dr. Gonzales will also be taking questions throughout this process. I shared with everyone our Regional Humanities Network Code of Conduct. We want to make sure that these conversations are as inclusive and open to people as possible. So please keep in mind that Code of Conduct as we go forward with this conversation and make space for everyone to be heard. It's really crucial that we have a open space, that people feel welcome and that they feel comfortable having conversations and discussions about topics which might be, in some cases, divisive or potentially problematic. So we want to make sure that we're tolerant and open as part of the process. And so if everyone can join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Gonzales. Thank you. Laura, take it over.
All right. Thank you so much, Robert, for the warm welcome. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I know that it's a sea of Zoom meetings, and so I appreciate you making time for this one. I would love for this space to be as conversational as possible. So I do have slides and lots of information to get through, but if we need to pause and kind of lean in on something, or like, just have a conversation, or if you have questions, or if you want to push back on anything that I'm saying, please do so throughout. Robert is kind enough to monitor the chat because sometimes it's hard for me to share screen and see the chat. So if you feel comfortable unmuting and just speaking up, even if I'm talking, please do so. I'd love to share ideas and learn more about your context and how language access can be incorporated into all of our programming, into all of our initiatives. So that's what I'll sort of touch on today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Let's see. We tried this beforehand, so it should work, but now it says an error occurred, so of course. But it just give me 1 second. Just reloading. And all right. Awesome. Do you see my screen? Do you see the slides? Okay. So just Robert gave a great introduction, but I just want to tell you a little bit about me. So I'm originally from Santa Cruz, Bolivia. My family and I immigrated to the US at age 9 when I was a child. And that experience of learning a new language really shaped my interest and what areas I wanted to be involved in. So that's what made me interested in doing work around language access, because, you know, learning a new language as a child, being involved in programming as a speaker of a language other than English really shaped who I am. And I think that language is the key to engaging participation, no matter what sector we're working in. So that's really inspired my work and some of the research that I've done that Robert already introduced to you. I've had the privilege to conduct research on translation and language access across the US in Florida, Texas, Michigan, as well as worldwide in Guatemala, Mexico, and Nepal, with a recent focus on indigenous languages of Latin America, because there's this assumption in the US that people who come from Latin America speak Spanish, but that continues to be increasingly challenged as more and more people who speak indigenous languages from Latin America come into our communities and have the right to access information in their languages. So I wanted to start with a question, and you can think about any event or anything, but I wanted you to think about, what does it look like for you to feel included? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? Maybe you can contribute in the chat, or if anybody feels comfortable unmuting and just sharing, like, maybe an example of an event you went to where you really felt included, or a feeling that you get when you feel like, wow, somebody really thought about me individually when they were coming up with this idea or this concept. So what does it look like or feel like for you to feel included? Feel free to share in the chat, or you can unmute. A personalized greeting, easy for me to participate. Any other ideas or thoughts? Asking questions, like feeling comfortable asking questions, sometimes can make us feel included, where you don't feel like hesitant as though people are going to think you're not intelligent because you asked a question. Someone checking in with you when you enter a space. I went to an event yesterday, and one of the organizers just came up to my partner and I and said, like, hey, what brought you here? And I was like, wow, nobody had ever asked me that question before. And it really makes me feel like my presence there is valued. Not having to explain your culture or your background, right? When you are with people who you know get it, and you don't have to like explain or even identify different parts of your experience. Yeah, asking what brought you here. Thinking about when your needs aren't treated like an inconvenience. That's a great one, right? When the things that you need are just there, and it doesn't have to be a special exception, or you didn't have to fill out a special form to ask for things. When there's clear instructions on how to interact with the space, yeah, sometimes that's not ambiguous, like that's very ambiguous. How do you react? How do you contribute to the space? Not feeling other just because there may be something different about me than other people in the room, right? And that's really difficult to do. And I would argue that in the US, it's really difficult to create a space that isn't by design white, and that isn't by design English dominant. Like, creating a truly multicultural, multilingual space requires a lot of intention. And yes, when we do this, we're not going to get it right every single time. But what I hope to share with you today is just some ways that we can continue to work toward increasing that accessibility. And the other point that I want to make as we have this discussion is that sometimes, or often, just inviting or saying everybody is welcome here is not enough to really create an intentionally inclusive space. You can feel like you would be fine with anybody coming into this.
Laura, you froze for a second. I think she might be having some bandwidth issues. So one of the things that she's really trying to talk about is making sure that everyone feels welcome. And by inviting people
Space,
doesn't necessarily
but
mean
are
that
you
that's
really going
going to
out
be
of
the
your
case.
way outside of your typical?
Laura, you're freezing. I think we're having some technical issues on her end. I apologize for that. I'm sure she'll join us shortly. One of the things that she was really trying to emphasize is this relationship of making sure that people feel included. And sometimes we make assumptions just by inviting people that they're going to come or that they feel that they're welcome to participate. And we need to make much more of an open conversation and atmosphere as part of that process. So I like some of the things I was seeing in the chat with regards to asking people questions, asking them what brought them here, what their interest was as part of that process as well. So there's a number of different things we can do, I think, to make people feel included. One of the things that Laura's going to talk about as well are the different pillars of interpretation and translation and outreach, and the fact that language access isn't just translating text or materials into another language, but we need to think of it more as a whole ecosystem, and the relationship of the things that we do in terms of programming incorporates the work that we do with the community from the development process and going out into the community where they are and what they're most comfortable with as part of that process itself. So we're lucky in that we're able to have Dr. Gonzales work with us as a staff at Maryland Humanities and help incorporate some of the work that was going on in her community. We're also undertaking, as part of our Regional Humanities Network component right now, listening sessions in Howard County with different organizations there as we develop our own language access program. What we're hoping to do in the future is have a language access plan for Maryland Humanities that's going to reflect what's happening around the state and incorporating more of these listening sessions to get a sense specifically what the needs and expectations are from community groups around the state itself. So we're really looking toward you as our stakeholders and as the groups that we're serving to let us know about those things. If there's particular ways that we can help you with your efforts with language access, please let us know. Please reach out to me and let me know. Laura, you're back.
Yeah,
Sorry
did
about
everybody
that.
get out or was it just me? I feel like it just turned off. I don't know. I don't know what
You
happened.
you froze for a little while and then you dropped off.
Oh no. Okay.
You
I'm
want to try to
sorry.
share your screen
Yeah.
again? Okay.
Yeah, that's so strange. Okay, here we are. We're
Yes.
right back
You're still a
there.
co-host.
Okay, cool. So I was going to share with you an example of what happens when we're not inclusive by design, and just sort of making the point that just saying we welcome or include everyone doesn't mean we really designed a space that is inclusive. And so this is a short video. I'm not going to play the sound. I'm just going to have you watch, but this is from a hotel bathroom. It's from a Radisson hotel. I think it was in 2011 when two people were in the bathroom and they realized that the soap dispenser does not work when a Black person puts their hand under the soap dispenser, but when a white person puts their hand under the soap dispenser, the soap does dispense. I wanted to show this with you, share this with you, because technically everyone was invited and welcome to use the soap dispenser in this public restroom that should be accessible to everyone, but that was not the case. So I want to share this with you really briefly. So you can kind of see, this is just a video that was recorded. And there's it's a Black man who put his hand under the soap dispenser and the soap did not dispense. And then the white man puts his hand under the soap dispenser and the soap did not dispense. And they did it multiple times and that continued to happen. So it wasn't a fluke. And this isn't the only technology that works this way. During COVID, people found that even oximeters that were meant to measure the level of oxygen in someone's body did not work as well for people with darker skin than they did for people with light skin. There's so many technologies that were designed this way. The people who designed these technologies would not say they intended to exclude people with darker skin tones, but they didn't intentionally include people of all skin tones in the design of this technology. In the case of this sink, I put a little description of what was actually happening here, where people who described this said the reason the soap doesn't just foam out all day is because the hand acts to more or less bounce back the light and close the circuit. And so it was really just a gauge that needed to be adjusted for different skin tones, but someone didn't think to do that before creating this design. A lot of times we don't think about designing for people other than ourselves with our own lived experiences, our own backgrounds when we're creating something. And then we still say, oh, this is created for everybody. But did we really think intentionally about who would be welcomed or invited and able to successfully use and participate in this design, in this event, in this tool, in this technology? Those are the questions that I think we need to continue to ask. And those are the questions that I think are very relevant when it comes to language, because oftentimes we'll say things like, of course, people who speak multiple languages are welcome to our event. But if you don't provide the promotional materials in people's languages, if you don't recognize the different languages that are present in the space, people are not going to show up. And then we tend to make the assumption that people were not interested or they didn't want to attend the event, when that may not be the case. So a lot of things in the US especially are exclusionary by design because they're not intentionally inclusive. And that's a really important flip that I think we need to make when we think about language access. So how do we design to be intentionally inclusive, especially when we're thinking about language? Couple things that we'll cover today. There are several policies that protect language access, so I want to cover those today. But I want to make the point that we really need to move beyond thinking of policy as a checkbox, like, yes, I provided translation, therefore my event is intentionally inclusive. That may not always be the case. A lot of times when we think about language access, we think about the numbers. How many people speak this language? How many languages do people speak in my community? But what I want to share with you are some strategies for thinking beyond the numbers to intentionally reach a group that is oftentimes overlooked or maybe just completely ignored in the design of many things in their community. I want to share with you some stories of language access and how I've used language access in different projects to increase participation. And then I hope that by the end of the session, you leave with really concrete strategies for what it is that you can do in your own events, in your own programming to increase inclusion through language access. And again, please jump in with any comments or thoughts throughout the presentation. So thinking about the policy, there's 3 policies I want to cover. When we think about language access, a lot of times we think about compliance. So any entity in the US that receives federal funding through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Title VI is required to provide language access. So the policy states that persons with limited English proficiency must be afforded a meaningful opportunity to participate in programs that receive federal funds. Now that's kind of wishy-washy language, right? How do we define meaningful opportunity to participate? Do we think that just adding the Google Translate widget to our website is enough for someone to meaningfully participate in our event? Or how are we defining meaningful participation? And so what I want to challenge you to do as you're thinking about programming is to sit down and define what meaningful participation looks like for your organization and think about how language can be incorporated into that participation. The second policy is Executive Order 13166, and I've linked out the full thing here, and I'm happy to share the slides with you after. But this executive order states that each federal agency shall prepare a plan to improve access to its federally conducted programs and activities by eligible limited English proficiency persons. So basically what this says is every organization that receives federal funding, which includes many nonprofits, should have a plan for how you're going to provide language access services. Now, does this mean you're going to translate every single event into every single language that exists? No, that's impossible. But what it means is that we should think really strategically about what information we need to translate into what languages and what other mechanisms outside of just translation can we incorporate into our programming so that we are providing that meaningful access for our multilingual community members. And then the third policy that I want to talk about is one that's oftentimes ignored when we're thinking about language access, and that's the American with Disabilities Act, which requires that state and local governments give people with disabilities an equal opportunity to benefit from all of their programs. Now, being a person who doesn't speak English is not a disability, but there are many people who speak sign language, and sign language requirements are embedded into this American with Disabilities Act as well. So there's really so many different policies that give us, general guidelines for what it is that we need to follow when we are organizations that receive federal funding. But there's so many creative ways to think outside of this checkbox and to really make sure that the resources we're investing into language access are actually usable by the people we want to reach. We can spend so much money translating things. We can spend so much money, printing things in different languages. But if we don't have a strategy for how we're going to reach the communities who speak those languages, then we're not going to make use of those resources, and those resources are going to go to waste. And we know that what will happen then is that the money for those resources will not be available in the future. So what I hope to share with you today is like thinking about a language access plan for engaging multilingual people through small but actionable and powerful steps that you can build on over time, so that you don't feel like you need to wait until you get it perfect until you have all the information to do something and to reach out to people who speak different languages in your community. Brief pause there. Questions or comments so far?
There's no new questions in the chat, just comments about what makes people feel welcome.
Awesome. Awesome. So thinking about the numbers, when people ask or when they're told that they need to provide language access services, I immediately get this sense of overwhelm. Like, how do we know? We need to do research into how many people, how many languages. We can't do anything until we know these things. And while it is very important to have a sense of who is in your community and what the majority languages are, it's also really important to think about the minority. For example, in many communities in the US, we know that Spanish is the second language, oftentimes most spoken in a community outside of English. That's not the case for everyone, but we know that's the direct assumption. And so Spanish speakers oftentimes have a lot of resources invested in making language accessible to them. But in some communities, that means a lot of other people are never considered when it comes to language access. So in my community, for example, we do have a lot of Spanish speakers and we provide a lot of language access services for Spanish speakers, but Haitian Creole speakers are growing in numbers and very seldomly considered when it comes to language access. So it's really important for you to think about not just who's in the majority, but who's in the minority that is not often considered, and how could those people provide a point of connection for your organization and an entryway to demonstrate that you really are invested in language access. So let me give you an example. In Baltimore, for example, this is a graphic that shows 89.32% of the population speaks English, where 9.88% of the population speaks other languages. And so from policy makers and people in the city, it might seem like, we don't need to invest a lot of money into language access. We don't really need to do a lot because most of our people speak English. But out of a population of 585,000, 9.88% is over 57,000 people. And so if you are providing services that are intended to include everybody, and you're excluding 57,000 people, that's actually a lot. That's actually a lot of families. It's a lot of stories. It's a lot of interaction that you may be missing out on just because you only focused on the majority. So one of the things that I like to share, because in the city of Gainesville, for example, is where I'm located in Florida, we get a lot of pushback saying we can't do anything for language access until we do more research to know exactly what is needed, exactly in what languages. And again, I'm not saying that's not true, but I'm saying that that narrative of we can't do anything until we have all the information is often a tool of white supremacy that is used to keep any progress from happening. And I really love this argument by Dr. Ruha Benjamin in her book, Viral Justice, that I've linked here. She calls this push for more and more data before we take any action. She terms it the datafication of injustice. And she uses the example of the negative health conditions that Black women experience across the US because of the oppression they face on the basis of gender and race. And she says, oftentimes, we get asked for more data, more evidence that this oppression has negative health impacts on Black women. She also extends this to multi-generational immigrant homes, where it's been noted that there are negative impacts to immigrant households through generations because of the hardships and oppressions that immigrants face when they come to the US. And she says it's fascinating to understand that on a cellular level, like our cells are impacted by oppression. But at the same time, do we really need another study to prove something we already know? Do we really need another study that says, yes, people really need language access services, or yes, people really need access to information in a language that they prefer, or yes, people will feel more included if information is available in their languages? We know that, right? The datafication of injustice is the hunt for more and more data about things we already know much about. And again, I'm not saying we don't need to do research about the languages needed or the language access services needed. I'm saying that if we only focus on the numbers and we wait until we have the perfect data to do something, we're really going to miss lots of opportunities to engage with communities who really can contribute a lot to our organizations and vice versa. So what Benjamin says is, this is a quote, we should ask ourselves whether research is serving as a stall tactic, so we never collectively act on what we already know when it comes to engendering health and well-being. And so I'm just providing this as our resource because I think when we advocate for language access services and we say we really need to think about multilingual people, the first thing that people do is say, well, who, how many, how often, how much? And those are important questions, but that doesn't mean we can delay the action until we have that critical information. So I wanted to share this concept with you as a resource because it's been really helpful to me. So what do we do then? If we're not going to focus just on the majority and we're not going to wait until we have all the data, what can we do to continue working toward language access in our programming? Think about the touch points for your organization or your event. How do people engage with you? Is it through your website? Is it by calling? Is it an office that they need to walk into? Where and how will people need to engage with you and with each other? And at which of those touch points do you want to start to explore how multilingualism could play a role? Into what languages, into what, for what specific events? Maybe you can't provide translation of the entire website, but maybe there's a really critical event that's a huge touch point for your organization. Start there. Who are you envisioning at these touch points when you think about who's in touch with your organization? Are you considering multilingual people here? And if not, who's being excluded? So it's unlikely that you're going to be able to provide translation into every language for every touch point, but where can you start this year? Where can you start this month? Where can you start this week? Who can you get to know? What are stakeholders already in your community? Nonprofits, restaurants, churches, places where people already congregate that you can start to be in touch with, even for one event, for one listening session, for one strategic planning meeting. That can go a really long way because a lot of the engagement with multilingual communities happens through word of mouth. And if people have positive experiences with you, they'll continue to come to you and they'll bring others. If we want to think by numbers, though, and you want to make an argument, let's say that your population is 10% immigrant multilingual. Great. And your event is intended to serve everybody, right? This might be different. So like if your event is only intended for families who have kids in K through 12, your populations might be different. But let's say 10%, relatively, humble percentage, is immigrant or multilingual. Is 10% of your marketing budget committed then to multilingual outreach? And if not, why not? Are you then using the resources for that 10% of the population for the majority, and then ignoring that 10% minority? So it's an interesting way to kind of think about how our outreach efforts are or are not being invested in the multilingual community, even if that multilingual community is not super large. If you are providing interpretation and translation services, or if you're doing an event that's multilingual, how are you letting people know that these services are provided? A lot of times I hear people say, well, we tried it once, but nobody used it. We signed up for a contract with a language line to provide interpretation, but nobody used it, so we didn't have it next year. Well, think about these numbers at the beginning and think about how you're letting people know of these services so that you get accurate counts of who uses or does not use the services. Awesome. Any questions or thoughts so far?
Nothing in the chat presently.
All right, awesome. Again, feel free to unmute if you have any reactions to any of this. What I want to share with you now are some stories. So some things, small initiatives that I've seen work really well in communities to gain that multilingual interaction, not often with a lot of resources being invested into it. When we ask people about their language, a lot of times, right, we think of compliance, But when we ask people about their language, it's really a way to connect with their heart. And so when we're trying to go and grow engagement in any sort of organization, we can use language as a way to connect with people. So when we include people's preferred languages, we're extending an opportunity for connection because, like you all were saying early at the start of the session, when people are asked things about themselves, or like, why are you here? Or what are you interested in? Or what brought you here today? Tell me about your language. You're really asking people about their identity, about their culture, about their background, and you're making them feel like they really matter in that space. When you ask people about their language or you include their language, you're going to connect to their passions because language learning experiences often connect to immigrants' passions and dreams. They're in the US for a reason. They probably had to learn English as a second language. There's probably some really interesting experiences embedded into that, and learning about that really helps you know your community. And then finally, asking people about their language helps you understand what mechanisms of participation people will really need or benefit from. Because when you ask them about their language, you can also ask them about how they like to participate, what information is helpful to them. Would an interpreter be helpful, or maybe would a community of speakers of that same language who can translate for each other at an event be more welcoming and warm? You can learn about all of these things by asking people about their language. I wanted to share with you a couple of examples. These are examples from our recent projects where we did a museum exhibit. We welcome people who speak different languages. The project was about language. And at the end, we had these cards kind of posted up on the wall, and we asked people to just let us know, like, why is your language meaningful to you? And then what experiences have you had speaking your language in our community? So I wanted to share some of these responses just so you can get a sense of like the richness of response that you might get when you ask people about their language. So one community member said, I grew up speaking Greek at home and learning more specifics about the language, history, and culture from my grandma and grandpa. I can now pass down this wealth of information and keep our traditional culture alive. You know, in the humanities, we're often really interested in stories because stories connect people. Asking people about their language is a way to learn their story. Another person who speaks English, Spanish, and Russian said, language is a way to bridge divides and help make connections for those who cannot help themselves. I thought that was really powerful. Even a person who said they don't speak a language other than English can reflect on their own experiences and say, when I visited France, I could not read anything, signs, menus, museum notes, or understand the language. For the first time in my life, I felt like an outsider, lost and alone. And it's so interesting to think that this person had that experience for the first time as an adult, because so much of their general environment was very much tailored to them, right? So thinking about language and language experiences can help us understand our different positionalities, our different levels of privilege, our different stories. When speaking your language in Florida, how do you feel? One participant said, not understood, so having to speak English very slowly. Thank you for understanding. So again, having that opportunity to express themselves. And then finally, a participant said, as a Black woman English speaker, my language and my body/identity cannot be separated. When I speak, my whole culture flows through my words. Each pronunciation, beat, accent, etc., is up for interpretation. Is it too Black? Is it too white, or not enough? And so it's interesting and really important to consider the connection between language, identity, race, and positionality. Sometimes somebody will speak, English with an accent, and it's a marker of their difference. Sometimes just by being in a space, someone is marked as different. Sometimes somebody will speak English in a way that you don't recognize they speak another language at all. And so thinking about the connections between language and identity can help us understand how to design really inclusive spaces that consider the entirety of an individual's identity. In another project, we asked people to describe images, so like birds, food, plants from their country, and we incorporated these images into the design of our exhibit. We just provided brief little descriptions of them, but we wanted people to feel included, not necessarily through translation, because this was a space where most people spoke English as well as their heritage language, but we wanted them to feel included beyond the translation. And so, for example, one of our participants and contributors from Ghana who speaks Akuam Twi said, "The eagle reminds me of home and of my language. It's a symbol my mom always used as a language of strength and power. Whenever I see that bird, it reminds me of her, and that means I think about home." And so in creating an event, we interviewed several people in our community, very short interviews, sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes they extended longer. And we asked them, what images make you feel included in your community? And then we incorporated those images into the design of our space. It didn't need a lot of explanation. Many people can pass by this eagle and be like, oh, that's a really cool bird, right? But this participant who was part of our community really felt connected and thought of home through that image. And so finding ways to even subtly include this representation in our design can create a long impact and can help people feel like they were thought of in the design of whatever it is that we're creating. These are some other examples. The one on the left is from a participant who spoke Aymara in Spanish. And this is like the university tower on our campus. We live in a college town. And so the aguayo was one of the quilts that are traditional to her culture. And we incorporated that into the university to sort of show those different layers of identity coming together. And then the one on the right is a participant from Vietnam who shared different dishes that were important to her. And we incorporated those into the design of our space. So again, did this mean everybody felt included walking into our space all the time? No, but we did have that opportunity to show with at least a few people that we thought of them in designing this initiative, and that when they're coming to our organization or engaging with us, we're going to do our best to continue growing that representation. A lot of times, we can design spaces that are multilingual, we can provide interpretation, but people can still feel excluded or feel like they are facing oppression or experience oppression because of the structure of a particular space. So I wanted to share with you an example of this participant. His name is Misael. Misael is an interpreter. So he's the professional court interpreter who's often called into the courts to provide interpretation services for people who speak his language. And this is what he said when he was describing that space. He said, when an Indigenous brother comes into a court hearing facilitated by the state government, instead of feeling confident, he feels scared, terrified. And no matter how much he may want to express that he agrees with or doesn't agree with something, he won't do it. Why? Because of the space he's in and the people he's around. So Misael gets paid to go to the courts and interpret for these sessions for his community, but he's not given the space at the beginning of the session to introduce himself to the audience. When we welcome interpreters to our spaces, we should allow them the time to introduce themselves to the community that they're serving and create that trust, create that bond that will allow the session to happen successfully. If we don't do that, then you may as well not have had the interpreter hired at all for the event, right? So thinking about intentional design is not just about checking the box, I have an interpreter, but it's about being intentional in the space that you're creating as welcoming, as recognizing of everybody in the room, and giving the interpreters space to be their professional selves in that capacity as well. Any questions or thoughts so far?
I was saying how he really liked the idea of incorporating the imagery of identity into the piece that you were talking about prior to this.
Awesome. Yeah, I think imagery is so powerful in a way that, a lot of times we focus so much on like, oh my gosh, translation is so expensive. But if we can be really intentional in the imagery that we create for our events, we can open up that access, sometimes even more than we can by translating a bunch of words. So thank you for that. On the topic of interpreters, another thing to consider too is, again, if we provide language access, we also have to create spaces that are inclusive in terms of race, gender, disability status, and so on. This is from an interview that I did with an interpreter of Haitian Creole. And she said, even though as a translator, you're a professional, so again, she was hired for different organizations, when you come into a white space, anti-Blackness continues. You're treated like you're lazy, like you don't know what you're doing. People want you to finish a translation quickly and to not take too long to interpret, all while you're just trying to do your job. So again, this goes back to the idea of, yes, translation, interpretation, having these things is important, but it's just as important to create a space that is actually inclusive and intentional in who it includes and how it treats people coming into a space. A multilingual space, right, a space where many languages are present, can still be a very white space, and this may not be the inclusion that you want it to be. So it's important to always think about the connections between language, race, and positionality. Dr. April Baker Bell, in her book, Linguistic Justice, Black Language, Literacy, Identity, and Pedagogy, said that linguistic hierarchies and racial hierarchies are interconnected. So people's language experiences are not separate from their racial experiences. Indeed, the way a Black child's language is devalued in school reflects how Black lives are devalued in the world. So we can be as linguistically inclusive as we want, but if we're not thinking about racial equity alongside with language, we can really have the potential to do harm. So in summary, what I want to say about these stories is that language is a site for so much. It's not all negative and it's not all talking about oppression, but it's a site for painful experiences, for joyful experiences, for struggles, for dreams, for ambitions, for questions, for reflections. It's a site for humanities discussions. Language can really be an entry point into understanding who it is that you're trying to engage, what stories they have to share, and what stories they want to hear. Okay, so I'm going to move on to sharing specific strategies with you of like how you can incorporate these language access principles into the work that you do in your different organizations. And again, please feel free, like if you have comments or thoughts throughout, you can unmute and share. So I want to make a distinction between access versus participation. So at the start of the session, we had talked about the different policies that protect language access rights, and it protects the rights of individuals to access and have meaningful participation in your organization. So access means that I have the ability to understand the information and attend an event. And that's great, that's important. But participation means that I feel comfortable in the space and that I can speak back to what is being communicated to me. So when we think about access in organizations, we oftentimes think about there's an agency, so Maryland Humanities, Language Access Florida, and we think about access in terms of, can this organization communicate to a client or a community member whatever information is available or whatever information I need to share? Can then communicate to another client, how many languages are represented here? That's access. Participation, on the other hand, is where an agency or organization does communicate to a client or a community member. But this is critical. Can that community member then speak back to the agency? So an example, you have an event flyer, you translate the event flyer, you share the event flyer, the person who speaks Hindi gets the flyer in Hindi. Excellent. At the bottom of the flyer, it says, for questions, please contact this place at this number. Can the person call that number and access information or ask a question in their language? If the answer is no, then why is that entryway open at the bottom of the flyer, right? If the person can't actually speak back to the information that you provided for them, they probably can't participate and have meaningful participation. If a client can speak back and does reach somebody in their language, or if there's a mechanism that says, for more information in Hindi, here's a link to the information that we have in Hindi online, or for more information in Hindi, we have someone on staff who speaks Hindi at this time, or we have a contract with a language access line, so please call this line to then call us, whatever your mechanism is. If it goes well and the community member can reach you in that way, chances are they're going to tell somebody else. And then you're going to see your numbers grow. And then somebody else one day might be like, well, I'm free this weekend. I want to do something with my family. Let me reach out to that agency and ask them. And if that goes well and the agency responds, that person will let their initial person know, hey, this went well. Thank you so much for connecting me with this organization. And they'll tell somebody else. And that person can reach out to the agency can reach back, and the community members can tell each other about how they were able to meaningfully participate in this space. And that is how you'll see your engagement numbers grow with multilingual communities. It really is about a few people having that positive experience and then bringing their family. And that's how you're really going to see the power of that 10% immigrant population or 5% Spanish speaking population, whatever it is. It's really about intentionally thinking about people who are not often thought of in your organization, making an intentional effort to reach those people in a consistent way, and letting word of mouth and letting your reputation continue to grow within that community so that more people come. So I wanted to share with you the components of language access because there's different pieces that we can think about. And again, I'm not saying everybody needs to do every piece of this all the time perfectly. I've run several events that are very imperfect. And so I understand that there's so many constraints, but there's different pieces that we can think about when we're trying to like just take a few initial steps to increase language access in our organization. We can think about translation as one pillar of language access. So translation is written information, making written information accessible into additional languages. When you're thinking about translation for your organization, I recommend not translating entire texts because you're going to waste more money and time doing that, but rather thinking about what is the key information. So if you have a 20-page annual report, before you send that off to translation, for translation, summarize it into a one-page key highlights that people from different communities may really need to know, and send that off to translation because that's going to be more accessible to people than a 20-page text-heavy document oftentimes. The second component is interpretation, and these translation and interpretation are often used interchangeably, but they're two different things. And somebody who works as a translator may not work very well as an interpreter and vice versa. Some people are very good at converting information from one language to another in written form. And some people are very skilled at converting information from one language to another verbally. And this can happen a lot of different ways. You can hire an interpreter to come and interpret at your event simultaneously, which means that people have headphones. This is like, you see this in a lot in like UN sessions or big court hearings where people wear headphones and the interpreter is speaking into a microphone. People are tuned into the same station and listening to something be interpreted for them at the same time. Or you can hire an interpreter to do simultaneous or consecutive interpretation, which means somebody speaks and then the person takes a pause so that the interpreter can then interpret the information. You have to account for different things depending on the type of interpretation that you acquire for your event, because if you're doing consecutive interpretation, the event is going to take longer, right? It's going to take longer for you to share that information, but you're going to incorporate different pauses for people to contribute, ask questions, ask for clarification. So you might increase engagement in that way. So when you're thinking about your events, think about what type of interpretation do I want? Is interpretation necessary at this event? Into what languages? And how do I let people know? Which leads to the third part, the third component of language access, which is connecting with multilingual community members through outreach. This can be done through different social media channels, different restaurants, different churches, different community centers. Again, you don't have to do it for everyone all the time, but thinking about what are the communities that could really benefit from this specific programming? How do I reach out to them to let them know that not only do we welcome them here, but we thought of them here because we provided this information in their language. Not only do we want them to come, but it's really important to us that they do show up because we have all these resources that are especially tailored for them. So thinking about that outreach. And then finally, maintaining that two-way communication with community members through engagement, which means that after the event, the community members have a way to follow up with you, ask about the next event, give you feedback on how that interpreter went or how the experience was for them, what happened, what things could be done better, and so on. So thinking about language access, you want to think about all these different components: translation, interpretation, outreach, and engagement, and how your programming is aligning with each of these pieces. Again, not all at once, not in every language all the time, but in the languages that you want to focus on for this amount of time for this reason. Questions or comments?
I don't see any questions or comments in the chat, but I wanted to ask you something. One of the things, I was just recently at the American Alliance of Museums, and there was an incredible presentation by the Perez Art Museum in Miami, which I'm sure you're familiar with, talking about multilingual groups. And one of the things that we talked about as a group was the fact that there's also a significant difference between translation and cultural interpretation, that often organizations just translate word for word what's on the flyer, and they miss the essence of what it is that they're trying to say. And that you truly need a community member and a partner to work with to take that information and make it accessible in a meaningful way, that you just can't. Some organizations were talking about like using AI to translate things word for word, and how that's highly problematic because it didn't necessarily convey the meaning of what you're hoping to convey. So working with a community member is really like a best practice with regards to interpreting it in a, not verbally necessarily, but culturally interpreting it in an appropriate way. And also the difference between dialects, the difference between Cuban Spanish versus Venezuelan Spanish versus, Spanish from the mainland.
Yeah, absolutely. Then those differences are so important. An example that I learned from during COVID is when we were doing translations of COVID related information, and there was a lot of fear in the messaging, like stay away from each other, social distance, wash your hands consistently. And many Indigenous language speakers said that doesn't fit with the reality of where we live. We live in multi-generational homes. So this idea of social distance from everyone didn't really work well for us. This idea of wash your hands consistently didn't work if we don't have access to clean water all the time. And so thinking about providing translated information that fits within the reality of, or the cultural mindset or the orientation of whatever community you're working with is really important. And again, it's one of those pieces that feels so overwhelming because it is like, oh my gosh, now I have to think about not just Spanish translation, but Cuban versus Puerto Rican versus Bolivian versus Dominican Spanish. That's so much. And so rather than feeling or leaning into that sense of overwhelm, it's like, okay, this is an opportunity for me to get to know what works best for my community. Let me start somewhere. So yeah, I agree with you, Robert. That makes a lot of sense. Any other comments or questions or any reactions so far?
I've been taking a ton of, this is Aya. I've been taking a ton of notes over here. I just really appreciate this workshop and the time that it is coming. I work in an organization where we provide legal services for artists, and we really have absolutely no language access. So this has just been super duper helpful. So I'm just kind of extending a thank you. No questions, but just want to say thanks, and you're awesome.
Oh, thank you, Aya. Thanks for the feedback. And you're not alone. There's so many organizations. And sometimes I'm like so baffled. I'm like, where in Florida? We should, of course, think about language, but there's just so much going on, especially when we're providing social services. So thinking about what are those steps that we can take, so that we are doing something and moving towards that impact that we're aiming for. So thank you for sharing.
There's a couple of comments. Jill pointed out that translation is also a different skill than fluency, which I know is definitely true. My mother is a fluent Portuguese speaker, but she would never be able to translate something because she learned from speaking and came to this country as a young girl, so never learned how to read and write in an academic way. So there's a differentiation, as Jill's saying, in terms of translating for a different audience versus fluency and having a conversation. And
Yeah.
also Kyla pointed out the fact that she wants to say it's an important consideration when we're thinking about translating significantly difficult topics and content like trauma, histories, events, and stories. Again, the relationship of cultural competency and sensitivity and knowing a bit about the context there is really crucial when we're trying to interpret some of these stories.
Yeah, I think that's such an important comment, Kyla. And even when you don't think you're touching on traumatic subjects, when you're asking people about their language experiences, you can get so much, it gets so deep so fast because a lot of the oppression and the pain that people face is tied to that experience, not of their language, but of having English imposed upon them for whatever particular reason. So I think that's such an important thing. And yeah, the difference between fluency and translating, which is why, we really recommend translating or simplifying documents as much as possible. And it's not because people who speak languages other than English can't handle complex information, but it's because you have to think about accessibility on multiple layers at a time, thinking about what literacy levels people have in the different languages. And since you're only going to translate once into that language, making it as accessible as possible on a literacy level in addition to a linguistic level at the same time. So yeah, simplifying those documents. There's so many times that people send off documents without thinking about it, because they're like, oh, the translator will deal with all the complexities. And it's like, no, you know your organization, you know the initiative you're trying to do. Simplify that information first so that the translator can do their job well. And I think that's a really good lesson that you're pointing to, Jill. So
Yeah,
thank you for
I wanted to add that children, especially in families that aren't speaking English, can be leaned on as like the bridge between the adults, and so then you're talking with a child who might be 8 or 9 or 10, and so their literacy, even if it's developmentally appropriate at that, you're speaking with an 8-year-old. And so being sensitive, first of all, about what we're asking children to do, but also know that when a child is asked to be in that role, or their family is relying on them to be in that role, that they are, working in a skill that is different from fluency. And so they have this other developmental skill that they're working within, and it's challenging.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's so much research that has been done on like the pressure and stress that kids face, especially like if it's interpreting for their parents at a doctor's appointment or something, and it's like, my parents' health depends on me doing this correctly, and the doctor is speaking like in really complex ways. It's really unethical sometimes. Like, I understand, and sometimes it's an emergency and it needs to happen, but like you're pointing out, in other times it's really unethical to put that pressure on such a young child when the hospital or the health agency or whatever receives federal funds and is required to provide that access for the community member. So yeah, thank you so much for pointing that out.
And that happens quite a bit in terms of education when you're interacting with parents and trying to explain things, and the children are often the translator, like you said. And part of the problem, I think, too, is sometimes you're translating words that there isn't the right vocabulary for, or children don't have the context or understanding what that actually means. So even if they're translating the word again, it doesn't fit into the context of medicine or banking or insurance or whatever. They don't understand and they can't comprehend the context of the discussion as part of that process. But you're completely right, Laura. I've seen lots of situations where the internal pressure from a child to take that on internally and feel the responsibility for their family is just overwhelming often.
Exactly. Yeah, it really is. Any other comments or thoughts? I wanted to share with you this scenario. So I've done a lot of research with people who benefit from interpretation services at different meetings. And this scenario was developed from some of these interviews with people. So as I read this to you, I just want you to think about what could be done differently. Because in this case, the people are investing time and resources in setting up language access services, but it still didn't go well. So here's a scenario. So for a city council meeting, the city brings interpreters to facilitate communication between council members and constituents. The council members feel good that they remember to bring interpreters, so pat on the back. The council members assume that because the interpreters are present, constituents will automatically feel comfortable sharing their ideas. But this isn't the case. Their errors begin with the first interaction with the interpreters. Instead of interacting with the interpreters and introducing them, the city council members just begin talking. So they just start talking like normal, don't even point out that there's an interpreter. They talk quickly and don't pause, and the interpreters scramble to keep up. One interpreter has to interrupt the council member to slow down, but the council member quickly forgets and resumes their former pace. The constituents watch this unfold and begin to distrust that the interpretation is full and accurate. When the council opens the floor for questions, one community member asks a question and the interpreter mediates. When the council member answers, instead of looking at the constituent, they look at the interpreter. So tell her that, this happens too often. Like many interactions with white people, the constituent feels ignored and rendered invisible. Feeling disrespected, the constituent doesn't come back. The council member is oblivious to the harm that they did and never follows up about how the interpretation went and what they could have done better. And so what happens then is constituents don't come back, and then people make the argument that there's no need for funding for future interpretation because the services aren't being used. There's so many different things that could have been done differently through just a slight adjustment to actually increase engagement and participation. Would anyone like to share something that you think could be done differently in this context? One thing that we often recommend is whenever you're working with an interpreter, speak to the person you're speaking to. Instead of looking at the interpreter, instead of saying, tell so-and-so this, speak to the person like you're speaking, but maybe take a pause to allow the interpreter to finish their interpretation. In some languages, there's not a direct translation of certain terms, especially like if we're thinking about humanities concepts, for example. There's so many concepts that need to be described rather than just translated because there's not a direct connection or translation. So giving the interpreter some time to provide that explanation can be really helpful. And treating the person you're talking to like the person you're talking to by looking at them, by acknowledging them, by recognizing them. Whenever there's an interpreter in the space that you're working in, it's really important to introduce that interpreter as a human being. Like, this is Laura. She will be interpreting for us today. Laura, if you need to ask any questions during the interpretation, please raise your hand so that you can ask for some clarification. Make it okay for the interpreter to be part of your event rather than just an aside. And then, of course, thinking about the different layers of power that are at play in something like a city commissioners meeting, there's a lot of power dynamics playing out between the council members and the public who's there attending. And so thinking about how power is playing out in your own event, how are people going to feel empowered to ask a question? Are you getting to know them before the session? Are you setting the tone of comfort and collegiality? Because those things will really impact if and how your interpretation services are used.
So I was waiting for others to speak, but I think the point about looking at the person is just respectful is when it comes down to it. I've done a lot of work with ASL interpreters before, and it's like you said, I think it's helpful to recognize that person, but they understand as an interpreter that it's their job to help you understand what the client or the visitor is saying. So you're not disrespecting the interpreter by looking at the person who you're having a conversation with. And that's often what a disconnect is. Sometimes I think people feel like they need to look at the interpreter when that's not necessarily the case. Something else that's sometimes helpful, like you said, is having information that you can give in advance if possible about specific terms, have a glossary, information that you can give to people, especially working with interpreters in advance. I know this is something that we've done in past in organizations I've worked with or even conferences to give them as much information up front so they can prepare themselves as interpreters and they're not learning because at that point, they're trying to do interpretation. They're listening to you, they're interpreting for the visitor, and they're trying to figure out all this vocabulary at the same time. And it's overwhelming for that interpreter as part of the process. So the more we can do up front to try to lay the foundation for success, I think the better.
Exactly. Yeah. And giving that introduction, but also allowing, like Misael was saying in the story I shared earlier, allowing the interpreter to introduce themselves to the person or the community that they're interpreting to, it builds that trust and it might make it more possible or more welcoming for people to ask questions and participate. So thank you for that. So the executive order that I introduced early on mentioned a language access plan, and that sounds really intimidating, but a language access plan is really just what is your strategy for reaching people who speak languages other than English in your organization. I share a template here. I won't pull it up now, but it really just like allows you to list, what is our organizational mission? Who are the people that we're intending to serve? And then what language access services can we provide now? And it's okay if it's not a lot because at least you're listing what you have and acknowledging that you have a way to go. And then also, what language access services can we plan to provide in the future? And how are we going to build out to that? So somebody was mentioning earlier, like not having any language access efforts at all. So where do you start? Where do you want to start? Do you want to start by doing a listening session with people who speak a specific language in your community and coordinating that? What's the outreach strategy for that? After that happens, how are you going to assess and see if it went well or it didn't go well? Basically, a language access plan is just setting up the stepping stones to providing the language access requirements that you want to provide for your community. And I really recommend whenever you're launching a new initiative, whatever the initiative might be, having an engagement plan that includes language access in some way can help you keep track of your broader language access plan. So if we're going to have a book club about a specific book, and this is our plan for engaging different people, you might have the typical networks that you typically reach out to, but you might say like, you know, we're going to have a marketing person spend 5 hours a week reaching out to multilingual networks. And we're going to track what those networks are, and we're going to see if and how we're able to reach people that way. We're going to track it so that for the next event, we can zoom in on just a couple communities and do some in-person outreach for them. Or whatever your strategy is going to be, thinking about what are those small stepping stones that you might take to ensure that your language access is expanding rather than remaining the same throughout the year. So a language access plan, again, is a document that spells out how to provide services to individuals who don't speak English or have limited English proficiency. Language access plans to be tailored to your individual organizations, but they might include similar sections: your organizational mission, what are the top initiatives of your organization? Again, what are those touch points where people interact with you? What are the mechanisms that people interact with you? And then the third piece, how are you thinking about multilingual people at those touch points? And if you haven't started to think about that yet, where are you going to start? And how are you going to hold yourself accountable? It's really important, I think, for language access plans to be public so that you can hold yourself accountable and say, okay, in 6 months, we're going to reassess and see how this went, and we're going to launch this next initiative, or we're going to do a survey or a listening session or a focus group, whatever it is, to see how you can continue to progress forward with language access. Another thing that could be really helpful, and we're working with Maryland Humanities to do this now, is to think about your bank of templates for different events that you have, and think about how do you prepare these for translation so that you can save yourself some money and time by not translating information that's not going to be helpful. So in working with Maryland Humanities, we asked them to identify what are some typical flyers or information that they share with their community members or community members every year. So for example, this is just one for a program called Museum on Main Street. And we worked with a designer to condense the information so that we're using visuals as much as possible. So we transform some wording into these little icons: museums, libraries, colleges, other cultural venues. And then we created a template where in each version or in each language that this might be translated into, there's going to be a brief program description, icons to visualize part of the information, something that links to the audience, a description really short of what the program offers, and then contact information. And so rather than translating a longer form or a longer multi-page document, think intentionally about what visuals you're going to use, how you're going to simplify that language to provide critical information. And that's what you can send out for translation. There's so many translation services. There's probably people in your own community who do translation work. And so by simplifying this information and working with them, you're demonstrating that you're intentionally being linguistically inclusive, and you're also reducing the amount of content that needs to be translated. You're also helping to maintain or grow an archive of documents that year after year you can distribute. So things like your organizational mission, those things get reused and reshared all the time. Descriptions of programs, if you have those already in multiple languages, you can share them out year after year on social media channels, and you can continue to expand the number of languages that you serve because you already have the basics kind of taken care of. So part of your language access plan can include a link to a folder with this information that people can continue to build on, especially with turnover and people leaving the organization. If you document your language access plan and resources, then you don't have to start from scratch every time somebody new comes into the organization. So when you're thinking about an event, an initiative, thinking about planning for translation is really important. Prepping the documents for translation, thinking about how will someone get help in your organization in languages other than English, thinking about what documents are you going to prioritize for translation. For most of our organizations, if we were to translate everything, we would not have budget for anything else, right? So thinking about what are those critical events, and then what are those documents within those events. At what events will you provide interpretation, and into what languages, and how are you going to let people know that interpretation will be provided? I provided here a link to a language access budget guide. Again, I won't pull it up now. You can look at it later, but it's important to think or consider that translation into different languages has different costs, and the costs depend on how rare the language is. So Spanish is a very common language. Translation into Spanish is more budget friendly than translation into indigenous languages, for example. So you might want to consider that when it comes to your budget. And again, think about what's your overall marketing budget. From that budget, how many people are multilingual in your community? How much are you dedicating to language access? And then within that, what languages are you providing language access services for? Which ones are the most common, and which ones are the ones that are not common, often ignored, but are places you want to tap into to increase the access of your organization? I also wanted to provide a couple more tips for working with interpreters. You know, you can get access to a language access line, which is a phone number that you can use anytime somebody calls your organization. You can call this language access line and get an interpreter over the phone. They're very budget friendly typically, but again, just like with anything else related to language access, it's important to be intentional in how these interpretation services are used. So providing training for your staff on how to use the language access line, telling them that they need to speak more slowly, just providing some tips. So I wanted to share some of those with you. Of course, being friendly is really important. And friendly is not just like, oh, let me be nice, but be intentionally inclusive, especially when people are coming to your organization who look different than most of the people regularly in that building, in that space. It's really important to think about what does welcoming and friendly mean from an intentional perspective. We mentioned this about speaking directly to the person that is getting the interpretation instead of speaking to the interpreter. You should speak slowly, but there's no need to yell or be louder than normal. That doesn't actually help. One thing you can do is do comprehension checks regularly and ask if people have any questions. So a comprehension check is asking people to repeat what you just said. So if you're talking to somebody, having them repeat to you what you just said in their language to make sure that, you know, they said it correctly or that they're understanding the key facts. Not assuming that both the interpreter or the person you're interpreting for understands the information without that sort of communication. And then this one's really important, and this is both in written documents and in verbal events, but trying the best that you can to avoid jargon, slang, abbreviations, acronyms that the community member may be unfamiliar with and that people who typically engage with your organization may be familiar with. So spelling out acronyms, you know, simplifying the language as much as possible is really important, and again, makes people feel like you've thought of them and intentionally included them in your communication. So a couple of things when measuring engagement, a couple of things for you to consider, because I know that it can seem really overwhelming. Like, okay, I have to make a language access plan. I have to plan who I'm going to reach out to and how I'm going to engage them. But like, how do you do that? So a couple tips for that. Think about what sector your agency or organization is in. So are you in education? Are you in health? Are you in safety? Like, what specific sector are you in? Then consider, are your services for everybody in their community or just for specific groups? Because that's going to influence where your outreach is. What Facebook groups or Instagram accounts or whatever you're reaching out to depends on the types of services that you're providing. How do your engagement numbers compare to the demographics of your city or county? So if 10% of your overall population is immigrant, but how many of those have families if you're doing programming for specific families, or how many of those, you know, qualify for the specific service that you're talking about? And then within that, how are you targeting specific groups through your marketing and outreach strategy? So are there channels that you haven't considered? And a lot of times you're going to learn about this by talking to people in your community. Talk to those big stakeholders that are in charge of places where lots of community members from that group go to. So again, going to community centers, partnering with nonprofit organizations in your area that serve specific language groups. Again, churches, restaurants, community centers, there's different areas, and making those connections intentionally and slowly. Go to their events, see what their events look like and feel like. Let them know about your organization, build that connection, because it might seem like you're just connecting with one person, but you're really providing an entryway into an entire community. So thinking about how you're assessing that engagement after the event is also important. So is there a survey? Is that survey translated? Are you reaching out to these people to see like how things could have been done better so that the next time you do them, you can make those improvements? Again, these are big questions, but I wanted to provide you both with broad strategies, but also very specific tools and resources. So hopefully you've taken away at least some of those things through this discussion. And of course, all of this will be shared out after. I wanted to throw another scenario at you to help us think a little bit as we wrap up here. So let's say that your organization is launching a new program for families. The program will take place in a local community center during the summer, and it will provide youth and families with free lunch each day. So what are some things as an organizer for this initiative that you would consider in your access strategy? Like, what are some things you would do to reach multilingual people in this strategy? Anybody have some thoughts?
Again, we're a small enough group that you can feel free to just unmute yourself, but if you feel more comfortable putting it in the chat, I can relay that for you as well. I think one thing I would consider is how we're doing the outreach to the community and meeting people where they're at, where they're comfortable, knowing who the community is, and if they center themselves around a religious organization, or if there's particular service groups that they communicate with on a regular basis in the community, making sure that we're not expecting them to come to us, but we're doing the best we possibly can through word of mouth and through leaders and through identifying where they're most comfortable is where we're going to reach out to. Jill said identifying community ambassadors who can spread the word about the programming. Again, identifying who within that community is respected and part of that, who can serve as a liaison between the organization and the community itself.
Yeah, see what events are already happening, who's leading those events in these different communities, and then attend them, see how they're structured, and see if you can share information about yours. Community ambassadors or leaders are critical. I mean, we have different chat groups and social media groups that are led by members of different communities who can spread the word for us, because they're a trusted resource more so than our own agency or organization. Connecting with similar organizations. Yeah, that's a really good one. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I just said connect with similar organizations. I was just, wasn't sure if you were seeing the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, connecting with similar organizations. The idea of providing families with free lunch each day, that's a huge resource. So connecting with organizations who provide meal services. So think about like, what is the actual thing that we're providing for families? What organizations are providing that for different community groups? How can you let them know that free lunch will be providing? What is the topic of the engagement that you're doing? What are organizations focused on that specific topic? That can be really helpful. Make sure that the language about free lunch is front and center. Yes. And this is where the iconography comes into play, right? So thinking about free lunch, some sort of image of free lunch, thinking about what that food icon is going to look like can be really helpful, and it can actually make a huge difference. And thinking about what social media channels you want to engage with. Sometimes you can get like paid ads that are not super expensive, but that can target specific language groups if you have that information translated to reach those communities as well. So thinking about the visuals, I was immediately thinking of some sort of flyer or Instagram post and thinking like, what would I use to represent free lunch, and what image would I use to represent whatever sort of programming, so that the words were very minimal, but the ideas really came through. So just some strategies that you might think about to just expand that outreach a little bit more.
Jill also had a comment about making sure that the free lunch is front and center, to identify that as part of the program.
Absolutely. Yeah. What are people getting from coming to this? I think that's a really important question that we should ask ourselves, because otherwise the people who are going to come are the people who typically come, and they come because they like you, or they come because they know you. But thinking about what are people getting from this experience can be really helpful in reaching out to people who typically don't come to your events or your organization. Absolutely. Okay. A couple other ideas. I had shared some strategies, that I had used in the past with like interviewing people about their language, providing a space for people to provide feedback in their own language at an event, even if the event wasn't about language, just asking them about their language and what their language needs are. Some other things that can be helpful at different events is to do some collaborative translation exercise. And this can be really helpful if you're bringing in people from different organizations, asking them to provide a concept in their language that relates to the event. So like, how do you describe this event in Spanish? How do you describe this event in whatever language you speak? Have people describe these concepts using images, sounds, and movement, like decentering this focus on language, on words specifically, to really have people connect based on meaning. How would you describe collaboration, community? How do you describe the humanities? Hosting listening sessions can be really fruitful with different people at different locations. I think a lot of times we don't think about how hard it is to get to our offices because of transportation or schedule constraints. So going into the community and doing listening sessions at different settings to better understand what people need or what they like, or even what events they typically go to. And then the final thing that I want to say is everybody has a responsibility in the translation process or the interpretation process. If you're working with an interpreter, the interpreter is, doing the interpretation, but you also have to do your part by slowing down, by looking at the person you're speaking to, by taking up some of that work and some of that labor of the translation and interpretation. So thinking about, like, even as a person who speaks English and doesn't speak other languages, what can I do to take up my responsibility of providing language access? I think that's a really important question that we can all kind of hang on to. So with that, I think we have a few minutes for questions. Please feel free to reach out to me. It's just languageaccessflorida@gmail.com. I will share a link to these slides in the chat briefly, and I'm happy to connect further and talk more about your specific projects.
Some thank yous in the chat. So Laura, I have a question.
Sure.
Given the conversation, I said we just had this conference, this annual National Conference of Museums in Baltimore. We were lucky to have it here in our home area. There's a number of different conference sessions about language access and about multilingual programming. And one of the things that people were talking about was how to identify or privilege certain things in terms of allocating resources. So for example, like with ASL interpretation, trying to identify which particular programs to actually invest in interpreting and talking with the community about that. Or with the Perez Art Museum, they were saying they've got English and Spanish, and now they're trying to incorporate Haitian Creole, and they're trying to figure out what aspects to focus on. Do you have any strategies for institutions or museums in terms of how we figure out where to start and how to incorporate that into the work that we do?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's where I look at local organizations, like what nonprofits, and I do a lot of this research on social media, honestly, what nonprofits are doing events, what groups are they serving? Because to me, those nonprofits often start from an identified need that's community driven. And so I try to figure out what languages are those nonprofits serving, or what cultural groups are those nonprofits from, and how can I connect with them to learn about the languages that are provided. A lot of times we look at, so in Gainesville, for example, we looked at the top 10 languages spoken in our community based on the census. And instead of starting with the top 5, we went to like the bottom 5, which sounds like counterintuitive, but the bottom 5 of the top 10 are still in the top 10, but they haven't been thought of before, right? In most of our programming. And so for many of these groups, it was like, oh, nobody had ever reached out to us about this, because people are so focused on those top 2 or top 5 or whatever. So you can use the census numbers, but not go strictly by them in terms of who the majority is, but who is somebody that may be overlooked otherwise. So I would say those are 2 things: looking at nonprofits, community calendars, big churches or community centers that seem to draw a lot of people, and then figuring out what those languages are that community serves can be helpful.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions or comments. Lots of thank yous. Another thing that came up that I think is really important, as you said, is that we all have a part to play, but I know sometimes organizations rely too much on their staff who are not compensated for this work. They
Yeah.
happen to be bilingual or multilingual, and the expectation is when this work is being done, they are just given this as an additional responsibility without any compensation. And again, they're being exploited and taken advantage of part of that process. So do you have any recommendations or best practices about how museums and organizations, historic sites, cultural groups can avoid falling into that trap, or means of identifying how we can set up boundaries between what our workers are expected to do and making sure that we're able to appropriately compensate them for their efforts?
Yeah, I think the best thing is to set up a mechanism. So don't wait for somebody to say like, I should get compensated for this, but it actually, interpretation can be a huge way to engage with your community, because you can set up a mechanism where people from the community can sign up to interpret at your events. And it doesn't have to be a huge honorarium, but the fact that you're recognizing that as expertise and you're providing that opportunity, sign up to be a community interpreter for this type of honorarium at our next event, people are going to tell each other about that. And they're going to just be like, oh, you know, Maryland Humanities really recognizes my language, not just as something that I do for like to be nice, but as expertise. And they're recognizing me as like a member of this organizing event. So setting up the mechanism for recognizing your community members and using language as a way, you can even use that as a way to learn what languages are spoken in your community and say like, we're welcoming new members of our community to sign up to interpret for our events. Let us know what language you'd like to interpret into and why you'd like to interpret into that language, and like set up a survey, you know, because interpreters will speak English. So you can send it in English and say, tell me about your language. Tell me about the language that you speak here in Baltimore and why that matters to you. So I think it's about having the infrastructure so that you're not kind of retrofitting and being like, oh, yeah, we should have thought about that. But really being intentional and like setting it up ahead of time can be useful. Any other questions or comments?
Well, I wanted to thank Dr. Gonzales for this very engaging and interesting work. Again, the idea is that this is just the first step. Hopefully we can have you come back and go into more detail or depth about a particular aspect. As I mentioned in the chat, Maryland Humanities is now undertaking work to develop our own language access plan, but we need to hear from you. So please let us know what we can do to support you, how we can best serve your community. If there's specific needs, resources that we can provide, feel free to reach out to me. Our Director of Programs, Alexander Sonatas, is overseeing this project as well, and she's on the call, so you can reach out to her and send her information. We want to hear from you. As I mentioned, the Regional Humanities Networks is expanding the work that we do. This is the first workshop of many that we hope going forward. We're going to hold listening sessions around the state. The next one is happening tomorrow in Crisfield at the A&E district from 4 to 7. So if you're in the area, please feel free to reach out. There's one coming up on June 7th in Annapolis at the Arts Hub there, and we'll be there from 11 o'clock to 3 o'clock. Later in July, we're in Carroll County. We'll be traveling the state, doing this in partnership with the Maryland State Arts Council, and we want to hear from you all about what we can do to support your work. So please let us know. As I mentioned, we'll be expanding our offerings in terms of resources too. So hopefully we'll have additional information in a link on the new robust Regional Humanities Network component of our website with pages. So the information that Dr. Gonzales has been talking about, we'll make sure we'll upload there. And for those that couldn't make this particular session, we'll make sure that we'll be able to interact with them as part of that process. If you have any other questions about the Regional Humanities Network, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. Thank you again for Dr. Gonzales sharing your knowledge and information with us. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you all so much. Thanks for having me.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. Sorry about the tech issue. I don't know what happened.